Imagine you're living in a country with a gold mine beneath your feet. Turkmenistan is rich in natural gas with some of the largest reserves in the world. But instead of prosperity, you face daily struggles, shortages of basic goods, soaring inflation, and a government that controls almost every part of your life. You have limited access to the outside world, and even getting news from neighboring countries is challenging. This is the reality for the citizens of Turkmenistan, one of the most isolated economies in the world. How did Turkmenistan end up here? Why does a country with so many resources remain locked away from the global stage? In this video, we will dive deep into the history, politics, and struggles of life in Turkmenistan's isolated economy. It's a story of riches and hardships, of a nation trying to find its way in a world that it refuses to engage with. The Soviet legacy, from dependence to isolation. Turkmenistan wasn't always this isolated. In fact, it was once part of the Soviet Union, a vast empire that tightly controlled the economies of its member republics. For decades, Turkmenistan played a key role in supplying natural gas and cotton to Moscow, but at a great cost. Its economy was totally dependent on the Soviet system. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, Turkmenistan found itself standing at a crossroads. The country declared its independence, but rather than opening up to the world, it chose to close itself off. Enter Saparmurat Niyatsov, the country's first president. Known as Turkmenbashi, or leader of the Turkmen, Niyatsov believed that self-sufficiency and strict control over the economy were the keys to national survival. He didn't just govern Turkmenistan, he reigned over it. He renamed months of the year after himself, built golden statues in his likeness, and even banned popular music and ballet, believing they were foreign influences. While this might sound extreme, it was part of his larger strategy to keep the country isolated, both politically and economically. But the Soviet legacy was never fully erased. The shift from a planned economy to an isolated one proved challenging. While the Soviet Union may have dissolved, the mindset of total control lingered, leading to years of stagnation and a lack of innovation. The country became locked in an economic model that stifled growth and development. The birth of economic isolation. Niyatsov's vision for Turkmenistan was clear: no outside influences. He kept the country's natural gas industry under state control, and foreign investment was extremely limited. He believed that by isolating the economy, he could protect the country from external threats and foreign exploitation. But what was the result of these policies? The first major impact was a lack of diversification. Turkmenistan's economy became almost entirely dependent on natural gas. But without the infrastructure to develop other industries or attract foreign investment, the country found itself stuck in a cycle of economic stagnation. Niyatsov's successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, continued his policies, though he presented himself as a reformer. The economy remained locked in the same patterns of state control, and little changed for the average citizen. Turkmenistan remained, for all intents and purposes, a hermit nation in the world of global trade. The slow death of public services. As Turkmenistan's government funneled all its resources into maintaining its isolationist policies, the country's public services began to deteriorate. Hospitals, schools, and other essential services fell into neglect. Despite Turkmenistan's wealth in natural resources, citizens faced difficulties in accessing quality healthcare and education. The few public services that remain are typically poorly funded and plagued by inefficiency. Citizens often have to rely on the black market or travel to neighboring countries for services that should be readily available. The failure of the government to adequately invest in public services has created a growing gap between the ruling elite and the average citizen, further fueling dissatisfaction and resentment. Living in a locked-down economy. Life in Turkmenistan is nothing like what you might expect from a country sitting on such valuable resources. You'd think that with vast reserves of natural gas, the people should be living in comfort. But the reality couldn't be further from that. Shortages of basic goods. Turkmenistan is home to some of the world's richest natural gas fields, yet everyday essentials like food, cooking oil, and even toilet paper are often in short supply. You may walk into a store and find shelves bare, with only the most basic items available. While the government keeps promising that things will improve, for most citizens, this is just another day in the life of an isolated economy. Imports are heavily restricted, and the limited trade that does happen is controlled by the government. As a result, what you can buy in Turkmenistan is often overpriced, and the quality is not always up to par. If you want something as simple as a foreign brand of chocolate, you'd better be prepared to pay an inflated price. Inflation and currency crisis. The country's currency, the manat, has also become a symbol of the economic chaos. The government's attempts to control inflation have largely failed. The official exchange rate between the manat and the US dollar is one thing, but the black market tells a very different story. Citizens looking to exchange money on the street often get far fewer manats than the official rate would suggest. This massive discrepancy makes it nearly impossible for ordinary people to plan their finances. If the exchange rate changes, the value of your savings can plummet overnight. For many, this makes survival a day-to-day struggle. The digital wall, censorship, and isolation. In today's world, it's hard to imagine life without the internet. Yet in Turkmenistan, access to the outside world is severely restricted. The government censors almost all foreign news, blocks social media platforms, and monitors citizens' online activities. For many, the only source of information about the world comes from state-run news outlets, which are often full of praise for the regime and little else. The internet isn't just a tool for entertainment or socializing. It's a critical resource for education, business, and connecting with people globally. By blocking access to the outside world, the government is not only isolating Turkmenistan politically, but also hindering the growth of its citizens and economy. Brain drain, the struggle to leave. With no opportunities for economic advancement, many of Turkmenistan's brightest and most talented young people are desperate to leave. However, leaving the country is not as simple as booking a flight. The government imposes strict travel restrictions, requiring citizens to get special permission to leave. For most, this is an impossible barrier. Those who do manage to leave often go through dangerous or illegal means, risking their lives for the chance at a better future abroad. This brain drain has left Turkmenistan without many of the educated and skilled workers it needs to build a more diversified economy. Natural gas, the blessing and the curse. One might wonder, how does a country with such valuable resources struggle so much? The answer lies in the government's tight grip on Turkmenistan's natural gas industry. Turkmenistan holds some of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, but instead of using this wealth to benefit its citizens, the government has used it to maintain control. Natural gas is the lifeblood of Turkmenistan's economy. It funds the government, fuels state-owned enterprises, and sustains the country's isolationist policies. But here's the catch. Turkmenistan's gas exports are heavily dependent on China, its primary buyer. While China benefits greatly from Turkmenistan's gas, the country's dependence on a single buyer leaves Turkmenistan vulnerable to price fluctuations and diplomatic pressure. The gas wealth, instead of helping the economy grow, has entrenched Turkmenistan's isolation. The world's influence, international relations, and sanctions. For a country that sits on such valuable resources, Turkmenistan has very few international allies. The government's policy of permanent neutrality means it avoids military alliances, but it also limits its opportunities for trade and diplomacy. Western countries are hesitant to engage with Turkmenistan due to concerns over human rights violations and lack of transparency. Meanwhile, Russia, once a key economic partner, has reduced its involvement due to disputes over gas pricing. As a result, Turkmenistan finds itself more isolated than ever, with few options for breaking out of its economic rut. The country's foreign policy has also led to a lack of investment. Despite having the potential to become a key player in the global energy market, Turkmenistan's refusal to open up to foreign investors or engage in international negotiations has left it isolated. This has compounded its internal issues, making it even harder to diversify the economy. A glimmer of hope. Can Turkmenistan break free? Despite its struggles, Turkmenistan is not entirely without hope. The younger generation, frustrated with the lack of opportunity, is more connected than ever before and increasingly aware of the world beyond their borders. Could they push for change? It's hard to say, but as global energy markets shift and Turkmenistan's neighbors continue to grow and develop, the pressure for reform may become too much for the government to ignore. Furthermore, with the rise of new technologies and global initiatives aimed at addressing climate change, Turkmenistan could find itself at a crossroads in terms of its energy policies. As the world shifts toward renewable energy sources, Turkmenistan may need to adapt in order to stay relevant in the global energy market. Turkmenistan's story is one of contradictions, a land of wealth trapped in an iron cage of isolation. The natural gas beneath its soil should have made it one of the richest nations in the world. Instead, it remains one of the most closed off, with its people facing shortages, inflation, and restricted freedoms. So here's the question: how long can Turkmenistan afford to stay in this self-imposed isolation? As the world moves forward, Turkmenistan might find itself forced to adapt or face further decline. One thing is certain: change is inevitable, whether Turkmenistan is ready for it or not. So if you like this video, do subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon.